Across the globe, this is a uniquely challenging moment. From healthcare workers to those overseeing essential services, to those of us hunkering down at home. At Polar Bears International, we are inspired by the ways people around the world are caring for one another.
And we're committed to doing our part to support you.
So we'll be coming to you live from our homes around the globe, offering a special Spring Tender Connections series. Live broadcasts dedicated to learners of all ages, but especially to students who are learning at home.
Oh, hi! If you're a kid like me, go to Tundra Connections to learn all about polar bears and their favorite food, seals!
Join us each week this spring for something unique. Add Tundra Connections into the mix for your learning during COVID routine. Tune into a lighthearted live chat or enjoy a live stream over breakfast with two adorable polar bear cubs in the Netherlands.
Participate in conversations with scientists and take a deep dive into the world of polar bear research and policy. Ask your questions directly and learn from the experts.
Although we are physically distant, we can continue to find ways to be socially connected and come together with our friends, families, and communities.
We hope you'll join us to follow your curiosity and to find a little Arctic inspiration through virtual windows into the polar bear's world.
Hello and welcome to Polar Bears International Spring Tender Connection series. My name is BJ Kirschhoffer and I'm the Director of Field Operations for Polar Bears International. We don't typically offer live chats or webcasts this time of year, but we figured this would be a nice time to provide a little diversity to everybody's day. So I want to thank, first of all, Explore.org for helping us make these streams possible, as well as I want to thank our panelists who are joining us today, Megan Owen with the San Diego Zoo and Joanna Sully, who is most recently with Norwegian Polar Institute. So thank you both for being here. Megan, maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So as BJ said, my name is Megan Owen, and I'm a conservation ecologist at the Research Institute at the San Diego Zoo. And I feel like incredibly lucky because for the past 25 years, I've gotten to do work that I love. I get to study animals around the world. I get to look at the challenges to their survival. And I get to try to devise ways that we can do science that's going to help them survive long into the future. And my favorite species to study is the polar bear. So I'm excited to be here today.
Do you say that during your panda webcast too, or is it just during polar bear webcast?
I say it with everything.
Okay, perfect. And Joanna, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me. My name is Joanna Sully, and as BJ has introduced me, I am a master graduate at the Norwegian Polar Institute. And there, under the supervision of Jon Orch, I was writing master thesis looking into maternity denning of polar bears on Svalbard. And throughout my master project, I had a privilege to join PBI, Polar Bears International's team, and Megan on projects to look at maternity dens in Svalbard and to install cameras, all of which we're going to talk about today, actually. So that was also incredible. Yeah, that was also an incredible privilege. And yeah. A very powerful experience to look back at the footsteps I had taken since I was a kid, fascinated by the Arctic and by the polar bears, and looked at by little choices and turns in the right directions going up after I went down, I managed to find myself to do something useful, to actually participate, or to give something to the polar bears that fascinated me so when I was a kid.
That's excellent. So it's a good segue. Today's webcast is Mysteries of Moms and Cubs, and we're going to talk about those mysteries and how we're working to try to unlock some of those mysteries. So today's web chat will last about 20 to 30 minutes, and we'll include time for questions and answers. So during the broadcast, if you have a question, feel free to submit it to questions@pbears.org, or in the chat window down below. We've got moderators standing by that will issue those questions over to us. So please send them our way, and I will relay them to our panelists here. So maybe we should do a quick recap. Megan, maybe you can kind of help us a little bit about the reproductive cycle of polar bears. What's happening right now with polar bears? Kind of what are they up to?
What's happening right now? But first of all, we'd have to identify what month it is, and I have lost track of.
I've forgotten.
I believe it's still spring. So if it's still spring, then polar bears are looking for as much food as they can possibly get their paws on. This is a great time for polar bears to fatten up. But another thing that they're doing this time of year is looking for mates. So this is the polar bear breeding season. And the polar bear breeding season basically runs from about March to early June. And during this time, they have to roam over thousands and thousands of miles of Arctic sea ice in search of a mate. If they're lucky and they find a mate, then they separate and they go about their business and continue to try to find food. And ultimately, they go through this process called delayed implantation. So a female polar bear, if she is pregnant, she might not actually start gestating that fetus for several months after she breeds. And what this does is it gives polar bears sort of a little more leeway and the timing of when they might go into a den, when they actually start the gestation process, and when those cubs are born. So they end up, after a long summer, summers are really hard on polar bears. There's not a lot to eat during the summer. And once they get through that summer, they get into fall, and late in the fall, they'll dig their dens in snowbanks. They dig their own dens in banks of snow. And the details of the denning vary depending on where in the Arctic a particular polar bear is. And once inside that den, the mom is going to stay in that den for 4 months. And for that entire 4 months, she's not going to eat anything. She's completely in that den. We think that the cubs are born late in December, maybe early January. And when that cub is born, it's about a pound, completely helpless, can't do anything on its own. And it might be part of a litter, maybe 1 or 2, or maybe even 3 cubs if it's one of the litters that are born on the Hudson Bay of Canada. And while that cub is in the den with the mom, it is eating, it is sleeping, it is growing. And by the time it's ready to come out of the den, it's probably about 25 pounds. And at that point, it has a huge responsibility in having to follow its mom out onto the sea ice and begin its life as a polar bear, which is a huge change from life in the den. So it's in the den for probably the first 3 or 4 months of its life.
Boy, that's fascinating. Even at 25 pounds, though, these cubs are still pretty small. I mean, they still need mom, right? Just because they're able to be outside of the den, they still need to spend time with mom in order to learn how to be a polar bear. Is that right?
That's right. And it's really, really challenging. Under the best of circumstances, we think that only about 50% of cubs that emerge from their dens with their moms actually survive through their first year. So it's not easy being a polar bear. And polar bear cubs stay with their moms for about 2.5 years. And during that time, they have to learn how to survive in the Arctic. And that means learning how to hunt and learning how to swim and learning how to make the best of some really, really challenging situations. It's not an easy life.
So since this is Mysteries of Cubs, Joanna, I wonder if you could maybe tell us, Megan described here that these bears are denning and underneath snow, course, they're more or less, they're hiding. They're really not only protected from the elements, but they're also kind of keeping themselves protected from potential dangers there. How would you go about finding a polar bear den if you wanted to search for one?
Right. So I think, well, you're the expert on the subject, and I guess you'll have a little bit more to tell us about the aerial surveys and the search using some really advanced technology. But one way to find a polar bear is actually to know where the bear is before it goes into a den. So one method that is widely used by researchers to follow bears is to put telemetry collars on them. And these are collars similar to collars that we put on our pets or domesticated animals, but it's equipped with some sensors and devices that are collecting information about the bear's activity and location and the environment around the bear. And then they're communicating with the researcher at home, and they're, well, basically sending text messages to researchers every now and then. So if, yeah, here we go. So
this is a collar right here, huh?
Exactly. So if a color like this, that nice and white, is on a polar bear, then a researcher can follow the bear across its voyage throughout the year. And if a color suddenly stops, so if we know that a certain bear settled, we know that it's less active, and we know that the temperature had risen, we can deduce that maybe the bear had found itself in a place that it's sedentary, it's staying in one place, and it's also warm. So one reason why bears are digging their dens is to create an environment in which those very small and helpless cubs can survive their first months of their life. And the snow den, despite being in the Arctic, high in the Arctic, it's a relatively very warm environment. So a collar that is recording the temperature around the bear's body will record a nice warm temperature, and that will tell us that a female is in the den, and we can know exactly for how long she's going to stay there, if she's peeking her head out, or we can try to deduce what she's doing. So that is one way of finding polar bears den. Historically, people had been able to find polar bear dens by just looking at any signs of bear activity. And as we learned on, or I learned on this, my short time participating in the project, that can be tricky. So technology is helping us a lot. And BJ is particularly interested in some high-tech aerial surveys. So maybe you can tell a little bit more about that.
Well, I think, yeah. So, I mean, of course, collars are really our best tool right now to figure out where polar bear dens are. You know, there are some maybe promising technologies out there that maybe could help us. But really, historically, thus far, the best ways are either going on long ski trips, looking for polar bear dens, or using collars. We hope to maybe prove some better technologies in the future, some special forms of radar, maybe. But of course, these things are still not quite as reliable as Joanna has said. Knowing where the bear is before it goes into the den, so that we can then figure exactly where it is as it's in. Megan, I want to ask you, since again this is Mysteries of Moms and Cubs, do we know exactly what's going on inside of the den?
We know very little about what's going on inside the den. Polar bears are extraordinarily challenging to study. And so as Joanna just described, the den is in the snowbank. It is completely hidden away. And it's not like, a brown bear or a black bear or even a giant panda will make their den in a tree or something that's going to be there one year and then it's going to be there the next year, and they might even use the same structure from year to year. And for those bears, you could actually put a camera inside the den cavity, and maybe that bear will come in and you can watch what's going on. But for a polar bear that digs their den in the snow, we can't do that. So even with all of the technology that we've developed to study wildlife over the years, polar bears in the den remain one of the last challenges of video observation of wildlife. And so we're working on different technologies that are going to sort of, we hope, will help us better understand what's going on inside the den. But one of our greatest resources actually is working with zoos, because when polar bears are born in zoos, we know where they are. We can instrument the den that they're going to give birth to their cubs in with cameras and microphones. And then we can leave the bear and let them go about their business and not disturb them during the birthing and cub rearing process. And through that, we're actually learning a tremendous amount about bears. Of course, it's not like studying polar bears in the wild, but over the years, we're starting to get a fairly clear picture of what's going on inside the den. We're also seeing a lot of variation. And so seeing that much variation in the zoo bears that we've studied really gives us a hint that there's going to be a lot of variation in wild bears too. So we're trying to understand what drives that variation. And we're trying to understand what are the most sensitive aspects of polar bear maternal denning, what period in the denning process is most sensitive to disturbance. And all of this information will help us devise better protections for polar bears.
Boy, this is a perfect opportunity. We got really great questions coming in from Lexi in Alberta. Are polar bear dens in protected areas, or can anyone just go out and go try to find one? That is an excellent question. Megan, I don't know if you have an answer for that.
It's an excellent question. And so some polar bear dens are in protected areas and some polar bear dens are not in protected areas. Also, some polar bear dens are in areas that are only protected if a polar bear den is found. So in the North Slope of Alaska, for example, where there's a long history of oil and gas activity, there are protective regulations in place for polar bears. And if a polar bear den is found, then all activity within a mile of that den have to cease. And that's pretty nice protection. But as was described earlier, it's really, really hard to find a polar bear den. So a lot of dens go undetected and so aren't protected. So there's just a lot of risk involved for polar bears. And with the changing climate, the risk is amplified quite a bit. So it's not easy.
Got another good question here, Joanna. Why do polar bear collars turn off when they're swimming? This is from Olivia, a teacher in New Jersey. Do polar bear collars actually turn off?
So they shouldn't, or at least when they do turn off, then it means that its battery life has run out and we have no more use from that collar. But polar bears are aquatic animals. They spend a lot of their time in the water, and that's also very valuable for scientists to know how much of their time they're actually spending in the water. And thinking of that, collars that polar bears are equipped with have a particular sensor that measures connectivity or conductivity, sorry, and it allows the researchers to actually pinpoint the moment in which the collar itself, then we deduce it's still on the bear, is immersed in the water. And having a time stamp on that information, we can actually track the bear's journey on ice, in water, back on ice, and in water again. So having a functioning collar that works when the bear is immersed in water allows us to see further into its life and to answer some of the questions that we might have, especially that their environment is changing, and those questions are quite pressing.
That is a great question. Thank you. Thank you, Olivia. If you have a question, be sure to send it over to questions@pbears.org or enter it into the chat window, and we'll get it over here to our experts to answer. So back to our mysteries of moms and cubs. Since we don't really know what's going on inside the den exactly, one of our best opportunities is to see what happens when they come out of the den. Isn't that right, Megan?
Yeah, that's been a really critical question for us for a number of years. And as we've chatted about a bit here, for the past 5 years now, we've been working in Svalbard studying polar bears as they come out of their dens. And this work is sort of an extension of work that was done on the North Slope of Alaska, again, by Dr. Tom Smith at Brigham Young University and his team, which included BJ here. And the idea here is that if we can't see what's going on inside the den, we can at least measure how successful the denning process was. So ideally, when the mom is ready to come out of her den, her cubs should also be ready to come out of the den. So BJ has developed these really incredible Arctic ready, fully deployable camera systems that we can ski out, place in front of dens. Actually, it's about 200 to 300 meters away from the dens. And these little units have these great cameras that can zoom in on the den and capture all the movement that happens around the den until the mom and cub are ready to leave the den site. And they make that first emergence, and that is a really big deal. But from there, they also have a decision to make about when to actually leave the comfort and security of the den site and start that life out on the sea ice. And we're finding a huge amount of variation in the amount of time that mothers and cubs stay at the den site. And we're really interested in what drives that variation. So is it something about the conditions, the sea ice conditions? If the mom senses there's going to be good hunting, will she make the decision to leave? Does she look at her cubs and sort of assess the readiness of each of her cubs to see whether they're actually ready to go out onto the sea ice? Or maybe it's driven by the mom's hunger. So perhaps before she went in the den, she didn't have a really good hunting season, so she didn't have enough body fat to sustain her much longer. So whether the cub is ready or not, she's going to head out. So we're using these cameras to measure all these different factors about what the mom and her cub look like when they come out of the den, and then what drives those decisions to leave the den site. It's been really wonderful research because it's getting this video of a family as they just break out of the den. It's just amazing to see.
That's pretty special. So here's one of the cameras now, and of course, these have been developed most recently in conjunction with the San Diego Zoo. Megan's got a great lab there with some great folks, and so we've been able to put together a very small package that's Arctic ready to capture these special moments. Joanna, you can see here is also in the frame. Maybe Joanna, you could explain a little bit, since we know where the bears are, since they're wearing collars. How do we then put out these cameras? What do we do?
So the entire process of decision making where collars are going to be placed is starting before we actually go into the field. So the whole project depends on the information about the positions of bears. So we can place those on a map and see how accessible those places are, and we can ask ourselves questions how logistically feasible and how safe, how expensive getting to those places would be, and is it. Then we can assess each location, and if the place is safe and if it's in an area that we can access, then we can prepare ourselves to pack the gear, choose the type of the transport that we're going to use, and make sure that when we are out there in the field, we are as fast as efficient as we can be. Because most of our work is happening before we are out there in the field. We want to be minimizing the time that we're spending near the den, and we also not getting too close to the den. So if we are out there in the field, we are going in the direction that we deduced earlier from the position of the collar that we were given, and we are looking for any signs of bear mother emerging, and we are looking if the snow on the slope that we are expecting then to be is maybe broken, if there's some breathing hole in the snow. And that makes the job much easier, because then we have a point at which we can fix the camera. But sometimes the slope is just pure snow, and you know that somewhere underneath there is a mama bear with some cubs um, um, resting safely under the snow, but we are not entirely sure where exactly the spot is. And that's when technology comes to aid. We can use GPSs, in which we already have the expected position of the collar. The collars now are quite accurate, and give a position of a bear in then like to 10-meter accuracy. I don't know how much that would be in feet, but 10 meters is steps, 3 very big steps. I guess 10 small steps. So if you're a kid, BJ's tall, so maybe he could walk that distance in less time. But yeah, we actually they're pointing, looking at the GPS and trying to see in what direction of a slope it's guiding us, and then looking at the device that measures distance to estimate our distance from the den itself. And then when we have all this information, we are setting the camera and using a quick setup. We're just drilling 4 screws to the ground and leaving the camera stable and hoping that no animals will be too interested on our cameras as scratching poles, because I guess that's a big risk when the mother bear emerges from the den. They want to scratch
or the
itself,
local reindeer potentially,
or the local reindeer. That's, I guess it's a
yeah. With the shortage of trees there in Svalbard, you know, I think they're probably looking for things to itch against. I think one of my favorite mysteries of this whole thing is when you get to a slope like this and there's no evidence whatsoever of a polar bear den underneath, but you know because of the collar that there's one there, and here we are standing in this, you know, serene landscape, just trying to figure out where the bear is. It's amazing how well they can hide in this environment. And even with all of our technology, all the fancy gadgets that we bring out into the field, we still have trouble from time to time figuring out exactly where they are. So polar bears are pretty good at what they do. We've got some other really good questions coming in. Megan, I think this one's perfect for you. Do polar bears use some sort of voice communication between mom and child?
Oh, that is a really, really wonderful question. Yeah, polar bears, when they're in their den, so we do know, again, from studying polar bears in zoos, the cubs are actually really vocal. The mom doesn't make much sound at all, but the cubs actually, when they're awake, they almost never are quiet. And they have a number of vocalizations that sort of convey whether they need something. And there's degrees, you know, of need involved. So it's like, Mom, I kind of want this. And then other vocalizations, which are really, really emphatic and really tell the mom that they are super hungry or super cold. And they also have this vocalization that is, we actually don't even really know what it means, but it's loosely associated with nursing, and potentially is a signal to the mom that the cub is getting milk and all is well. And we think that they might emit this vocalization because that will allow the mom to rest without having to be vigilant or attentive. So maybe it's a way to allow the mom to sort of save some of her energy. But it's really, really active. The cubs, you know, as soon as they can get mobile, as you see this cub here, they just start to play. And I always wonder what it's like for a mom that just gives birth to 1 cub as opposed to 2. Because if there are twins in the den, then the cubs can play with each other and mom can sleep. But if there's just 1 cub, that cub's going to want to play with mom, and that has got to be exhausting.
I've had the great pleasure of being able to go into a few polar bear dens doing this research. And after, of course, mom has left, when we go pick up the cameras, from time to time we're able to find the dens and go in and measure them. I cannot imagine being in one of those small little snow holes with 2 offspring. I don't think you'd get a lot of rest. There's not a lot of room in there. So another great question coming in from Jackie here. Joanna, do you know how long the collar batteries last for?
Well, that varies quite a bit, and the polar bear colors are not quite unified, and technology is still changing, and devices themselves are improving each series. So with time, the battery life is increasing, and also the color battery is feeding device, well, the sensors that are attached to the collar and the transmission of information that is coming from the collar through the satellite into the to the computer, and that costs battery. So you can play a little bit with how you want to manage your battery life and the amount or frequency of the information that you're getting, and a lot about getting, you before you start your research question and go out there and put colors or any animal, you have to ask yourself those questions, like what are your priorities and what way you can maximize the information that you gain with the minimizing the impact you have on an animal. So with maximum life of battery, how do you want to play? Do you want to get your information very often, and that will give you some answers about the particular behavior of animals, maybe like some feeding behavior or some specific behavior that is related to some part of animal's life? Or do you want to have a view of long processes that are ongoing throughout years, and that maybe will and like big ranges of animals and territories? So there's no an easy answer to the question. I think it's partly depends on devices that you use. Partly depends on the settings that you introduce the collar before you deploy it on an animal. But collars that are used on polar bears on Svalbard are sending information every 2 hours, and it's quite often. But those collars can last even their battery lasts even to up to a few years. So despite the cold and despite the amount of information they're sending out, they can be quite efficient.
I think I have one last question here for Megan. And, one of them here is coming in from Ryan from Toronto. Do mother bears try to take off their collars? I think the big question is, do they try to take off their collars, and how do the collars come off?
Well, the collars, there's a couple of ways the collars should come off. Ideally, most collars have a capacity to preset a release. So if you have optimized your battery usage and you have an expectation of keeping the collar on for a year, you can set the collar to release before that time, and then you can retrieve that collar. Additionally, there are ways to, sorry, my computer is acting funny. If for some reason the collar doesn't come off when it's planned, so a planned release, the bolts that the collar is attached with will erode in the saltwater environment. So the collar will certainly fall off over time. But I have to admit, so if you look at the collar that BJ is showing you, that collar design hasn't really changed in 40 or more years. The idea of tracking wildlife with a collar originated with grizzly bears in Yellowstone back in the late 50s, early 60s. And it was just a phenomenal innovation for wildlife science. But it's time to move this design on. And the data we get from tracking collars is unparalleled. We just can't get data like that any other way. And the understanding we have of polar bears has been largely developed through use of tracking collars. But right now, there's just a tremendous effort to use innovative technologies to make tracking a smaller, less invasive affair for a polar bear. There's some researchers are using tracking tags on ears, and they're much smaller. They don't last as long as a tracking collar, but they do give us some really good information. So there's all sorts of innovation happening out there, because at the end of the day, conservation is about populations of wildlife, but it's also about individual animals. And so we don't want to compromise the well-being of any individual animal in pursuit of the science that we're doing.
That's great. And I know we're running a little long on time, but an awesome question just came in from Jared here. Has anyone ever put a camera on a collar, Megan?
Well, yes, indeed. And that's actually was done by one of our postdocs at the San Diego Zoo, who's also a postdoc at the United States Geological Survey. And he had just this great project where he integrated a camera into the housing of the collar that BJ just showed you. And that was just extraordinary data he got with those cameras. And just the idea of seeing the world as a polar bear sees it, and it's incredible footage. He was able to see, what it looks like to hunt a seal, like you're seeing right here. And a number of times, again, finding other polar bears out there. So here's an animal that's solitary and is roaming all over the Arctic sea ice and finds another polar bear. It's really just phenomenal. So these different sensors provide us with unique insights into the lives of cryptic or elusive wildlife, and they really help us not only understand the animals, but also to devise new questions, because we learn little bits and pieces about what they're doing, maybe things we didn't even consider before.
It's super neat. It's really cool work. Well, like I said, we are running a little long on time. I want to thank you both, Megan and Joanna, for joining me today. Thanks to the San Diego Zoo and to Norwegian Polar Institute. This is a really neat project. The denning project that we're working on in Svalbard is a very cool project. Again, thanks. It takes the three entities to make it work. So it's fun to be able to come together to have this opportunity. So again, thanks to you both. Thanks to explore.org for helping us make this all happen. And tune in next week. It'll be our final week of Tundra Connections here. We've got 2 more broadcasts on Tuesday and Thursday. So be sure to join us. If we missed your question, we'll get to it either next week or one of our moderators will email you back. So thanks, everybody. Thank you both. And we'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.